For thousands of years, human wealth could not be hidden, stored, or forgotten. It was not kept in vaults or written into ledgers. It walked, it reproduced. It could be lost to disease, stolen in the night, or passed from one generation to the next. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. For the first time in human history, wealth was alive. And once value became living, power learned how to persist. For most of human history, wealth could not be stored reliably in objects. Food spoiled, tools broke, memory faded. Trust weakened beyond the limits of familiarity. Value existed, but it was fragile, bound to relationships and constant reinforcement. As long as survival depended on shared memory and proximity, wealth remained social rather than material. That began to change when humans learned to domesticate animals. The domestication of cattle did not begin as an economic innovation. It emerged as a response to environmental limits. In regions where agriculture was uncertain or impossible, herding offered a different form of stability. Grasslands, steppes, and semi-arid landscapes could not reliably support crops, but they could support animals capable of converting inedible vegetation into meat, milk, traction, and mobility. Cattle did more than feed people. They transformed time. Unlike grain, cattle did not rot after harvest. Unlike tools, they did not simply wear down. Unlike trust, they did not depend on constant social reinforcement. They grew, reproduced, and persisted. A herd represented past labor, present security, and future expansion at the same time. This reproductive capacity mattered more than any other property. If you store 100 bushels of grain, next year you still have 100 bushels, or fewer. If you store 100 cattle, next year you may have 120. Wealth no longer remained static. It multiplied itself. Nature introduced its own rate of return. This was the first time in human history that value became auto-scaling. Growth was no longer tied only to effort. It was embedded in biology. A herd expanded while its owner slept. The logic of accumulation shifted from preservation to multiplication. This was not interest as a calculation, but interest as a natural process. Wealth began to grow simply by existing. For the first time, surplus generated more surplus. Value no longer depended entirely on being remembered. It could now be counted. And it could now grow. This transformation left a permanent mark on language itself. Across the Indo-European world, words for wealth, payment, and value trace back to cattle. The ancient root pecu referred not to money, but to livestock. From it came the Latin pecus, meaning cattle, and later pecunia, meaning wealth. The English word pecuniary still carries this lineage. In the Germanic world, the connection was even more explicit. The Old English word feo meant cattle. It also meant property, wealth, and payment. From feo came the modern word fee. To pay a fee was once to transfer livestock. Even in the 21st century, our language remains tethered to the pasture. Cattle made wealth legible. They also functioned as technology. Before machines, the cow was the engine. An ox could convert grass into hundreds of kilograms of pulling force. It could drag stones, plow hardened soil, and extend human labor far beyond biological limits. Ownership of cattle meant ownership of power. Literal power. Before horsepower, there was ox power. This altered production itself. Land that could not be worked by hand became usable. transport became possible without human exhaustion. Cattle were not just assets, they were biological batteries. When you owned cattle, you owned stored energy, not abstractly, but physically. The economy acquired muscle. But this new form of power came with a constraint. A cow is a machine that requires a specialized fuel, land. It cannot be stored in a cellar or hidden behind walls. It must be fed, watered, and moved across open terrain. Wealth for the first time became geographically exposed. This necessity produced the earliest form of geopolitical strategy. Pastoral wealth could not remain static. Herds followed grass, they followed water, they followed seasons. Migration routes were not cultural choices, they were economic imperatives. The quality of pasture determined survival. The proximity to rivers and wells determined expansion. If the grass failed, capital vanished. If the water was poisoned, lineage collapsed. Long before markets existed, landscapes began to signal value. Fertile plains, reliable water sources, and seasonal grazing corridors functioned as the first indicators of prosperity. Control over land was not symbolic, it was existential. Wealth was no longer just a possession. It became a relationship with geography itself. This technological and geographic role reinforced hierarchy. Not everyone could own animals, not everyone could feed them. Control over traction, pasture, and migration routes meant control over land, labor, and output. Power concentrated around those who controlled living engines and the spaces they required. Cattle transformed social structure. In trust-based systems, obligation bound people horizontally. Survival depended on participation and reputation within the group. Accumulation dissolved over time as memory faded and obligations were repaid through continued contribution. Inequality existed, but it was unstable. Cattle altered this dynamic. Ownership introduced persistence. Control introduced hierarchy. Accumulation became durable. A person without cattle depended on relationships. A person with cattle controlled options. Wealth could now outlast illness, conflict, and even death. For the first time, inequality could be transmitted across generations. Nowhere was this more visible than in marriage. In pastoral societies, marriage was not only a social union, it was a reallocation of resources. A daughter's departure represented a real economic loss to her family. Labor, fertility, and future contribution left the household. That loss required compensation. This compensation took the form of cattle. From the Zulu lobola to early Germanic bride price systems, cattle functioned as living capital. They did not merely replace what was lost, they multiplied. A herd transferred in marriage could reproduce, grow, and sustain future generations. Women's fertility became economically legible through animals that themselves reproduced. Marriage became one of the first binding economic contracts, enforced without writing, courts, or money. Cattle also entered ritual life. Across early societies, gods demanded livestock. Sacrifice was not symbolic waste, it was the first form of taxation. By giving cattle to a temple or a chief, families deposited value into a collective system. In return, they gained protection, status, and insurance. If disease wiped out a herd, the community, often organized around religious authority, was obligated to respond. Sacrifice created claim. Ritual centralized surplus. Temples became storehouses of living wealth long before they became banks. The sacred and the economic were not separate. They were the same system. Cattle also changed conflict. What could be measured could be taken. Grain in pits is difficult to steal. Tools are scattered. Trust cannot be raided. Cattle, however, are wealth on legs. They can be driven away in a single night. Violence shifted from personal retaliation to economic strategy. Raiding emerged as a rational act. Herds required constant protection. Defense could no longer be improvised. This created a new role, the specialist warrior. Communities began to trade a portion of their living capital for permanent protection. Force became a profession. Protection became a service. Authority emerged around those who controlled herds, rotes, and armed men. You cannot have a king without a herd to protect. Yet cattle resisted complete abstraction. They demanded care. They aged, reproduced, sickened, and died. Disease, drought, and theft imposed constant risk. But this vulnerability was also their strength. Cattle tethered wealth to reality. They enforced attention and responsibility. A neglected herd collapses. A managed herd multiplies. This balance explains why cattle preceded metal as capital. They stored value without severing it entirely from social and ecological life. Wealth remained visible and therefore political. Anthropological evidence from Africa, the Near East, Central Asia, and parts of Europe shows recurring patterns. Herd ownership correlates with social stratification, ritual authority, inheritance systems, and gendered power. Where herds expanded, symmetry declined. Cattle did not create inequality, they preserved it. In earlier systems, imbalance dissolved with time. Memory softened obligation. In cattle systems, imbalance hardened into structure. Wealth could now persist without continuous social approval. This was a turning point. Value no longer depended on being socially reinforced. It depended on being protected. Cattle also bridged distance. An animal transferred between groups carried recognized value without shared history. It required no ritual explanation, no personal trust. Its worth was immediate and legible. In this sense, cattle functioned as a precursor to money. But they were not money yet. They were too alive, too demanding, too visible. They solved one problem and exposed another. They allowed obligation to be stored outside the human mind, but at the cost of hierarchy, inheritance, and violence. The economy learned how to persist without consensus. This transformation did not eliminate trust, it constrained it. Relationships continued, but they were now shaped by assets. Obligation could be negotiated, compensation could be enforced. Power could be maintained without constant reciprocity. The open loop began to close. Cattle reordered society around ownership, defense, reproduction, geography, and inheritance. They made inequality durable. They made power visible. They made violence economically meaningful. They were the first capital. Only later would metal replace flesh. Coins would remove life from value, reduce maintenance, and complete abstraction. But that comes later. Before money was metal, it was blood. In the next episode, we will examine how grain replaced animals as the dominant store of value, and why barley, not gold, became the first truly measurable currency of early civilization.